Greetings, urban farmers, gardeners, and healthy food visionaries. Farmer Greg here, and welcome to the 516th episode of the Urban Farm Podcast, where every day we work to educate and inspire you to become part of your food revolution. Have you ever pondered why you do what you do? Well, I have for over 4 decades. And I do all of this because I believe the most important thing that we can be doing right now is learning where our food comes from and how to grow our own. Our food structure in this country is in crisis. It delivers food that is unhealthy and is a delivery system that is tenuous at best. Over the decades, I've seen the extraordinary impact that small groups of people can have on the global food consciousness community, and I need your help. If you find value in the Urban Farm Podcast, please consider joining the Urban Farm Patron community to support the work we do. In exchange for subscribing, you will receive content and bonuses far beyond the free podcast episodes that we deliver. Plus, I am committed to making sure the value you receive goes far beyond what you contribute. Visit urbanfarmpodcast.org to see what you receive when you join us in revolutionizing our food system. Please consider supporting our work. It might be the most important thing you ever do. Today on our podcast, we have someone who balances the larger world context with local, practical, and creative solutions. We're talking with David Holmgren about downshifting to a resilient future. We're very excited to have the co-founder of permaculture on the show today. When I got David on the call, I just let him talk, and it turned into a 90-minute chat. So we decided to split it into 3 shows. This is part 1, and if you enjoy the content, please consider supporting the Urban Farm Podcast at urbanfarmpodcast.org. Since developing permaculture with Bill Mollison in the 1970s, David's local and global influence has gone beyond permaculture networks. He is a public intellectual working outside academia, government, or corporate support. His depth of thinking, design practice, and teaching has been continually informed by practical experience through a lifetime of household resilience, voluntary simplicity, and innovative action. He has received many awards, including an honorary Ph.D. from Central Queensland University. He's written 8 books about permaculture and related topics, been part of at least another 5 books, written multiple articles, given generous presentations, has over 40 years of practical experience. He is an authority on the permaculture concept and how to make it work. And basically, he's the guy who penned it. We are honored to have you on the show today, David. Are you ready to rock permaculture?
Yes, definitely.
Excellent. So I shared a bit about you. Can you fill in the blanks for us and share more about the path you took to get where you're at today?
Yes, I suppose for someone in their 60s, that's a long journey.
Yes.
I think being raised in a political, radical, activist family in the middle of the campaign against the war in Vietnam sort of cued me for not accepting what I'm told by authority in whatever form that might be, and choosing my own path, being prepared to swim against the tide, when the mob is heading that way, walking quietly the other way. So I think that was an incredibly important grounding. Looking back, I can see that although my upbringing in the suburbs of Perth in Western Australia was not particularly self-reliant, relative to today's world, of course, there were a lot of things that I osmotically absorbed, as a result of my parents growing vegetables and having fruit trees and chooks and all sorts of things that, of course, we're actually actively recreating now. And a lot of that has come through in my latest work. So that recognising that, I suppose, once you're of my age, that childhood influence was a different enough world that it actually has some lessons in that regard. But the exceptional nature of, my parents as radicals, as dissidents, as prepared to take risk and put themselves on the line in all sorts of different ways really cued me for having, that path with permaculture. Perhaps a step of radical rejection of upbringing was, rather than trying to stop all the bad stuff happening in the world, I suppose permaculture for me became an expression of how we are going to create the world we want by living it now. And I suppose as a student in a radical course for design professionals, architects, landscape architects, and urban planners called Environmental Design in Tasmania, where I was a student in 1974, I, by chance, happened to meet a character who was a little bit infamous in Hobart academic circles, in the small fishbowl of Tasmania, Australia's smallest state.
Uh-huh.
And that, of course, was Bill Mollison, but I didn't know much about him. He was never a lecturer of mine. I never went to any of his lectures. He was, in fact, at a different institution. He was at the Tasmanian University and I was at the then College of Advanced Education. But I developed a totally informal mentor relationship with him and, in fact, was sharing house with him. And it was through that we hatched the permaculture concept, and it became 100% of my time in the course I was studying. Now, it's a bit difficult to explain to people, how would that be possible when there's a curriculum and where there's a timetable?
Right.
Well, no, there were none of those things in environmental design. So I characterise it as the most radical experiment in tertiary education in Australia's history. And pretty classically, it ran from 1970 to 1980 before it was emasculated and turned back into a conventional design course. I was there 74, 75, 76. And of course, Permaculture 1, which was published in 1978, was largely based on the work and the manuscript, which I was working on in those years. So when I met Bill Mollison, he'd had 5 years at the front lines of the emerging environment movement in Tasmania, which, has since been acknowledged as one of the pioneering places in the modern world of where, environmentalism really took off. And he was a candidate for what was really the first Green Party in the world. And when I met him, he'd sort of come to the same conclusion that I had, even though we were a generation difference, that why don't we just create the world we do want rather than just battling or primarily battling against the things that are wrong.
Nice.
And so that was, apart from the conceptual nature of permaculture, in terms of philosophy and activism, it had that sort of background and lineage. When the response to permaculture was so huge, and it's hard to explain to young people, I suppose, what was going on in the late 70s, that 15 mainstream publishers could approach a sort of really an unknown and cantankerous academic from Tasmania and a completely unknown graduate student wanting to publish the manuscript that became Permaculture 1. What was going on?
No kidding.
Huge interest in, what we would call sustainability today. So permaculture sort of caught that wave. Of course, Bill Mollison's charismatic nature, gift of the gab, encyclopedic knowledge, and the fact that he was ready for a bigger stage than he had in the University of Tasmania, where incidentally he had more people come to his lectures apparently than any other lecturer in the university. But I never went to any of his lectures. It was all about what would be called today environmental psychology or sociobiology. It was sort of Bill Mollison's course, but I was much more interested in his capacity and skills and knowledge as a ecologist. But he was that polymath, interested in everything. Permaculture he really took it to the world. And I was, 23 when Permaculture 1 was published, and there was a lot of doubts I had. Firstly about, I don't actually have a lot of the lived skills and embedded knowledge that's actually behind the permaculture concept. And I was passionate about developing those practical skills. I was sick of academia. I walked away from the environmental design course before getting, the magic ticket that would enable me to be a, registered landscape architect. and embedded myself even more in developing the practical skills and the skills towards becoming a permaculture design consultant. And I was also, I suppose, aware of the potentially toxic nature of eco-fashion, rock star sort of status for someone in their 20s, seeing what happened to, a lot of the musicians.
Right.
And so I sort of like stepped away from that world. I mean, there were also, working with Bill Mollison when I was young and learning so much from, his incredible knowledge, I was able to ignore what a lot of people later recognised, I suppose, as his difficult character. A lot of geniuses are like that, and that it would be difficult to shift from that mentor relationship to a truly collaborative relationship. So that Bill Mollison really took permaculture to the world, and I went and applied the ideas as a guinea pig myself to see, can you make this work, in one place for one person? So I had a much more modest perspective, but, as well as being the co-originator of the concept, along with Bill Mollison, I've always acknowledged that he was the father of the permaculture movement.
Yes.
So, and the primary way he did that was not, of course, just his charismatic speaking and touring and that sort of thing, but was really through creating the permaculture design course that in various forms so many people have done around the world, and has been, I think most people involved in permaculture would agree, has been, the greatest mechanism for its spread. And I didn't become involved in teaching on a permaculture design course until a decade later, after they were started in 1990. Of course, I did a lot of public speaking and workshops in all sorts of ways connected to permaculture, and a lot of it through particular areas of expertise in reading landscape, in knowledge of trees and tree systems, and my passion for forestry, and in terms of property design and earthworks, and a lot of those sort of subject areas that I had, particular knowledge in. But it wasn't until 1990 that I was pestered basically by permaculture teachers to come and co-teach with them. So for 10 years I was a sort of an observer of permaculture design course process. And to some extent I've always maintained a role, or certainly for decades, as an internal critic of permaculture, not just in terms of the strategies of how it gets extended, but even pointing out the downsides in some of the techniques and strategies that, I'd been associated with creating. So, that role of kicking sacred cows and dogmas, sort of trying to prevent, the development of sort of very narrow, limited views. That certainly has been one of the criticisms back from, if you like, more traditional approaches to organic farming and other lineages that permaculture was associated with. Sometimes there has been that criticism of it being eco-fashion or, promoting things that, hadn't been sort of proven to work, or pushing those into places and contexts where they weren't appropriate. And, some of that has really just been how rapid the spread, the viral spread, if you like, of permaculture has been. So there's inevitably been, lots of failed projects or poor examples, and people with enormous enthusiasm doing things and then deciding it was all a load of rubbish because it didn't work for them. So those things are just part of the way, as I said in the book Permaculture Principles and Pathways Beyond Sustainability, that ideas get grubby in the real world. And permaculture, if you like, got grubby through rapid popularisation. Whereas if you compare it with, say, sustainable development a decade later, it came out of academia too, like permaculture did, and got very grubby very quickly in the world of international politics.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, so, those things happen, and I now, accept with a lot of equanimity those sort of things and all of the different interpretations and applications of permaculture, some of which I sort of, agree with and think are fantastic, and others I might go, oh, that's maybe off track or whatever. So there's always that relationship to something that's successful when you're the starter of it, that it develops a life of its own. And I think that's a great thing about permaculture.
Yeah. Well, and so how does it make you feel that you basically co-penned a concept that has touched millions of people worldwide and really has changed our future? How does that make you feel?
Well, as I was explaining, to some extent, it felt like it happened to me rather than I had this huge drive to go out and change the world. I suppose because I came from a family of activists, I didn't have the sort of, the naive notions that, yes, we're just going to put a lot of energy into it and we're going to, suddenly create a different world. So I had a lot of caution about that, or not the sort of the huge drive. And so I have an enormous appreciation for all of the things people have done with permaculture, because it's made my path so much easier to keep pushing forward, over a whole lifetime, because that positive feedback, is something that, comes back to me as the co-originator. Whereas, in fact, a huge number of people have devoted their lives to developing permaculture solutions and teaching and communicating those. And many of them have, burned the candle of their activism at both ends.
Right. And, you're talking to one of them.
And I, had that, in a lot of ways, I feel I've had what's felt like an easy road, even though a lot of people look at what I've done and they say, how do you sort of keep that passion and energy going over all that time? And, I suppose it's partly because I, don't necessarily have high expectations, but I get the positive feedback, from both my own successes and other people's successes.
Yeah. There was a time when permaculture didn't exist, and then there was a time when it existed. How did you and Bill make the jump from thinking about it to actually getting it created, getting it written down? What was that adventure like?
The first thing was that it was starting from a seed of, why doesn't our agriculture, if not look like natural systems, function like natural systems? And that, that was identifying the core unsustainability of our primary way of providing our basic needs through a working relationship with with nature, which is, of course, what agriculture is. And rather than just being some small part of the economy, it's actually the foundation for everything else. And, our past and our future sort of still essentially rests to a huge degree in that activity. So I think the crafting that was just really something starting very small in terms of what I was passionate about within the context of environmental design. But it was in 1976, when I was working on that Bill had been starting to talk to his students and suggested that what we were talking about was something significantly different from anything we could fully identify or recognise in literature searches and, other research. And I suppose it was his confidence more than mine that he suggested we needed a name for it. And, so coining the term permaculture was that, pivotal point. And that same year, we co-authored a 2-part article that was published in the Tasmanian Organic Gardening and Farming Society Journal about permaculture. So that was really a beginning point that was preceded the book Permaculture 1 by 2 years. And I think it was in the context of those organic movements in Tasmania that were already flourishing at that time, where, the ideas were first sort of exchanged and germinated. But as I said previously, it really became global very quickly in the early 80s.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the signposts for me that what we'd done was something significant was when there was a review by Earl Beinhardt at the New Alchemy Institute in Massachusetts.
Yes.
And that's one of the few groups that we could sort of find that seemed to be, working a bit along the same lines as we were at that time. John Todd and the work that came out of that, living machines, and, that was all part of that process. But they were also looking at the tree crops idea, which, of course, was central to permaculture. And, that review sort of convinced me that we had actually done something significant rather than just trusting Bill's, big out there view that, this is really something new and different. I mean, at the other end, of course, you get a lot of practical, down-to-earth, rural people, including farmers, who look at permaculture and say, well, isn't just a lot of that, or isn't it just all common sense?
Right.
And a lot of that's true. I mean, I would say, yes, a lot of it is just common sense, but it's no longer common. So I've always acknowledged that permaculture is, for modern people, reconnecting to a whole lot of things that we've lost, at the same time that it's grafting that together, that traditional common sense, and especially the common sense of more traditional cultures and indigenous cultures, with the new understandings from ecology and design science. And so that is a sort of a hybrid of things that have come essentially out of the modern world, out of science and design as a new literacy, and combining it with these more older understandings of working with nature, working with nature's patterns.
Wow. Thank you for that explanation. That was nice. How did you come up with the name?
Oh, well, as I said, it was Bill's idea that we needed a name, and of course it was his suggestion, and the notion of permanent agriculture, and obviously owes a lineage to Russell Smith and his work on tree crops, in which he said tree crops, the subtitle being a permanent agriculture. So permanent in the sense that we would today talk about sustainability, that the ability to persist. Now, of course, the criticism can be made quite validly that permanent implies some unmoving, unchanging thing like a rock or something non-living. But, of course, we definitely meant it in the way that Russell Smith was saying, of enduring rather than unchanging. So it has a lot of resonances with sustainability, which as a concept emerged a decade later. But of course, by permanent agriculture, we saw that as the foundation for permanent culture. Mm-hmm. Although Permaculture 1 was very much focused in the agriculture domain, by the time Bill wrote Permaculture 2, only a year after Permaculture 1 was published, 1979, in the introduction to that, he clarified that as it meaning permanent agriculture and permanent culture. Of course, all of that was informed by the limits to growth concepts, which were published in 1972, and made it clear that industrial society, really had no future in the long term, that it was both, to be blunt, shitting in its own nest, which would kill it eventually.
And here we are 40 years later, still having the same conversation.
Yeah, and that it was depleting the non-renewable resources that its existence depended on. So that we saw permaculture really as a response to that fundamental challenge. Okay, how do we work with less energy, work more with natural processes to do things in ways that don't require so much resources and don't damage soil, pollute the environment, and of course contribute to what has become the larger scale global non-negotiable forms of pollution, such as accelerating climate catastrophe that we're now facing.
Right. Thank you so much for joining us on the show today, David.
It's been a great pleasure.
And it's been a great pleasure for me too. This has been an amazing conversation. So how can our listeners get a hold of you and your organization?
Well, Holmgren Design is our website. Holmgren Design, that's holmgren.com.au. And you can see some of the things we do there. And the sister site is, of course, through Retro Suburbia. That can also access us. And our colleagues run the site permacultureprinciples.com, which is, a bigger spectrum of work that connects to us as well through those three sites.
Excellent. Thank you. And you can find show notes from today's podcast at urbanfarm.org/David Holmgren. This concludes part 1 of our interview with David Holmgren. Pay attention on Thursday as we release part 2 and Saturday as we release part 3. Thanks for listening. Hey, if you've enjoyed this podcast and are interested in listening to my first podcast series, Freshly Green from 2007, you can subscribe to support the Urban Farm Podcast. With that, you will have access to Freshly Green and so much more bonus content. Visit urbanfarmpodcast.org to find out more and to pledge your support.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Urban Farm Podcast. Remember to listen for tips, advice, and resources to help you on your journey with urban farming. You can find us on the web at urbanfarm.org or send us an email to podcast@urbanfarm.org. In the words of Vincent van Gogh, great things are done by a series of small things brought together. Be encouraged that with each lesson learned and skill developed, you are one step closer in the direction of your dreams.